February 21, 1916, Northeastern France. Dawn has not yet broken over the frozen landscape surrounding the ancient fortress city of Verdun when the silence shatters. At 7:15 in the morning, more than 1,200 German artillery pieces erupt in coordinated fury along an 8-mile front. The earth convulsively shakes as shells rain down on French positions with methodical precision. 100,000 rounds per hour tear through the winter air, each explosion adding to a crescendo that can be heard over 100 miles away in the Vosges Mountains. This is not merely artillery bombardment. This is industrial warfare at its most terrifying, a deliberate attempt to pulverize an entire sector of the Western Front into submission through the concentrated application of explosive force. The fortress of Verdun, which had guarded France's eastern approaches for centuries, stands at the center of a calculated German strategy that will transform this landscape into one of the most notorious killing grounds in human history. Over the next 10 months, this salient on the Meuse River will become synonymous with unimaginable suffering, as two great European powers lock themselves into a battle of attrition that neither truly wins, but both pay for in rivers of blood. What unfolds here will demonstrate both the industrial scale of 20th century warfare and the extraordinary limits of human endurance under conditions that seem designed to break the human spirit entirely. By the winter of 1915, the Great War had settled into a brutal stalemate across the Western Front. The war of movement that had characterized 1914 had long since frozen into the static deadlock of trench warfare, where hundreds of thousands of men faced each other across a moonscape of mud, wire, and corpses stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Massive Allied offensives throughout 1915 had achieved virtually nothing except staggering casualty lists. The Second Battle of Champagne alone had cost France 145,000 casualties for a maximum advance of just 2 miles. German Chief of the General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn surveyed this strategic landscape with cold calculation. A Prussian aristocrat known for his methodical thinking and personal reserve, Falkenhayn had concluded that Germany could not achieve decisive breakthrough on either the eastern or western fronts with the resources available. Russia, though badly battered, remained in the war. Britain was mobilizing its vast imperial resources. France, despite its losses, showed no signs of seeking peace. Traditional military doctrine demanded concentration of forces for a breakthrough, but Falkenhayn conceived something different, something darker. In his Christmas memorandum of December 1915, presented to Kaiser Wilhelm II, Falkenhayn articulated a strategy of pure attrition. He wrote that within German reach behind the French sector lay objectives for which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they had. If they did so, Falkenhayn coldly observed, the forces of France would bleed to death, whether the Germans reached their objectives or not. This was not warfare aimed at territorial gain or strategic breakthrough. This was warfare aimed at breaking an enemy's will through systematic slaughter, forcing France to sacrifice its army, defending a position of such symbolic and strategic importance that surrender would be psychologically impossible. Falkenhayn's chosen target was Verdun. The fortress city presented multiple advantages for this grim calculus. Strategically, Verdun's ring of forts formed a salient jutting into the German lines, threatening German communications and railway lines just 12 miles to the north. The fortress system comprised 20 major forts and 40 smaller positions, creating a defensive complex that had been strengthened over decades. But more importantly, Verdun held tremendous symbolic significance for France. The fortress had withstood Prussian siege during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, becoming a symbol of French resistance. Its loss would represent an intolerable blow to French national pride and military prestige. The Germans christened their operation Gericht, which translates as both judgment and place of execution, a name revealing the operation's grim purpose. Falkenhayn's plan called for seizing the Meuse heights on the east bank of the river, from which German artillery could dominate the entire Verdun sector. French forces would then be compelled to launch hopeless counterattacks against prepared German positions, where they would be systematically destroyed by massed artillery fire. The Germans would enjoy the tactical advantages of defense while nominally attacking, inverting the usual dynamics of trench warfare. Yet Falkenhayn made a critical error. He apparently never fully communicated his attrition strategy to his field commanders. Crown Prince Wilhelm, commanding the German Fifth Army designated for the assault, believed the objective was the actual capture of Verdun itself. This fundamental disconnect between strategic intent and operational execution would have profound consequences as the battle developed. Where Falkenhayn envisioned a limited offensive to threaten Verdun and provoke French counterattacks, Wilhelm and his Chief of Staff General Schmidt von Knobelsdorff planned a genuine offensive aimed at conquest. Ironically, French complacency had handed the Germans an unexpected advantage. Throughout 1915, French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, confident that Verdun's fortifications were obsolete in the age of heavy artillery, had systematically stripped the fortress of its firepower. 54 artillery batteries and 128,000 rounds of ammunition had been removed from Verdun's forts and sent to field armies. Plans had even been drawn up to demolish forts Douaumont and Vaux, and 11,000 pounds of explosives sat ready inside Douaumont. The garrison of the fortress complex had been reduced to minimal maintenance crews. France's most formidable defensive system had been deliberately weakened just as it faced its greatest test. The initial German bombardment on February 21, 1916, represented artillery employment on a scale never before witnessed in warfare. Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army had assembled 1,201 guns along the assault front, including 13 of the massive 420mm Big Bertha howitzers whose shells weighed over 1 ton each. The concentration of firepower was extraordinary, 1 gun for every 13 feet of front. Over 2.5 million shells had been stockpiled for the offensive, representing months of German industrial production. The bombardment targeted not just French frontline positions, but the entire infrastructure of the Verdun sector. French command posts, communication trenches, supply routes, and artillery positions all came under systematic destruction. The shells transformed the landscape into a lunar desolation of overlapping craters, shredded vegetation, and pulverized earth. French soldiers who survived described the sensation of the ground heaving like the deck of a ship in a storm, the air itself seeming to solidify from the concussion of thousands of explosions. Yet the French defenders proved more resilient than German planners had anticipated. Colonel Émile Driant, commanding 2 battalions of chasseurs positioned in the Bois d'Escauras at the tip of the Verdun salient, had warned superiors of inadequate defenses and received minimal support. Now his men faced 1 million German troops, backed by that unprecedented artillery concentration. Despite devastating casualties from the 9-hour preliminary bombardment, French positions held when German infantry finally advanced late on February 21. Driant's troops fought with desperate courage, buying precious time for French reinforcements to arrive, though Driant himself would be killed on February 22. The German assault made steady but costly progress through the shattered French positions. By February 25, just 4 days into the offensive, German troops achieved what should have been impossible. A small raiding party from the 24th Brandenburg Infantry Regiment approached Fort Douaumont, the largest and most formidable position in the Verdun defensive system. What they discovered stunned them. The fort, which should have been garrisoned by hundreds of troops, housed fewer than 60 territorial soldiers serving as caretakers. The main entrance stood open, its drawbridge jammed in the down position by an earlier shell hit. The coffers protecting the moats were unmanned, their revolving cannons silent. Without firing a shot, German troops entered Fort Douaumont and secured the entire position. News of Douaumont's capture sent shockwaves through France. The fortress that symbolized Verdun's impregnability had fallen through French negligence, not German prowess. In Germany, church bells rang in celebration, and the Kaiser awarded decorations to the raiders. For France, the loss represented a disaster both military and psychological. The German artillery now possessed commanding positions, overlooking the entire Verdun sector. Yet the German advance had already begun to slow. French reinforcements poured into the sector, rushed forward along the single road still connecting Verdun to the rest of France. The weather, which had been bitterly cold, turned to rain and then snow, transforming the battlefield into a morass of freezing mud that swallowed men, horses, and equipment. German casualties, light initially, began mounting as French resistance stiffened. Falkenhayn's plan assumed German forces could seize dominant terrain quickly and then settle into defensive positions. Instead, the Fifth Army found itself committed to sustained offensive operations in increasingly difficult conditions. On February 25, General Philippe Pétain arrived to take command of the French Second Army and the defense of Verdun. At 60 years old, Pétain was a career officer who had gained prominence for his defensive expertise and care for his soldiers' lives. He immediately recognized that holding Verdun would require transforming the entire French approach to the battle. Where his predecessors had focused on individual strong points, Pétain organized defense in depth, with multiple fallback positions and coordinated artillery support. Most critically, Pétain understood that sustaining the defense required solving a seemingly impossible logistical challenge. German artillery dominated or cut most approaches to Verdun. The railway lines into the city had been severed in 1914 and remained under German observation. Only a single secondary road connected Verdun to Bar-le-Duc, 70 kilometers to the southwest. This road, barely 20 feet wide and surfaced with crushed stone, became the sole lifeline for 300,000 French troops and the entire Verdun defense. What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war. The French organized an unending convoy of trucks that moved day and night along what would become known as the Voie sacrée, the Sacred Way. Captain Aimé Daumenc masterminded the traffic control system, establishing the world's first specialized traffic regulation unit just one day before the German offensive began. Trucks moved in a continuous stream, one vehicle passing every 14 seconds during peak operations. Broken-down vehicles were immediately pushed into ditches to prevent traffic disruption. The scale of this supply operation was staggering. Between February 21 and March 22, 600 trucks per day delivered 48,000 tons of ammunition, 6,400 tons of other materials, and 263,000 men to Verdun. By summer, 90,000 troops and 50,000 tons of supplies moved along the Sacred Way each week. Territorial units, totaling 8,000 men, worked continuously to maintain the road surface, shoveling 700,000 tons of crushed stone onto the roadway over 10 months to prevent its collapse under the relentless traffic. Paralleling the road ran a narrow-gauge railway, Le Musien, which could transport 1,800 tons of supplies daily, including much of the food for the 420,000 men and 136,000 horses at Verdun. A standard-gauge railway connection was rushed to completion by summer 1916, further increasing supply capacity. This supply system saved Verdun. Without it, the French defense would have collapsed within weeks. Pétain also implemented a rotation system that would see 70 out of 95 French infantry divisions cycle through Verdun during the battle. Unlike the Germans, who kept units in the line for extended periods, Pétain rotated divisions after relatively short periods, usually 2 weeks. This meant that nearly 3/4 of the entire French army experienced Verdun firsthand, spreading both the physical burden and the psychological trauma across the nation's military. When he took command, Pétain reportedly told his officers, "Courage, we will get them." But his most famous statement would come shortly after, "Ils n'y passeront pas, they shall not pass," which became the rallying cry of the French defense. The battlefield itself had become a landscape from nightmare. Constant artillery bombardment created a desolate moonscape of overlapping shell craters filled with stagnant, contaminated water. Unburied dead lay everywhere, bodies torn apart by high explosives, their remains scattered across the churned earth or buried in collapsed trenches, only to be unearthed by subsequent shelling. The stench of decomposition hung over everything, impossible to escape. Rats grew fat on corpses and tormented the living. Soldiers wrote of eating beside the dead, sleeping beside the dead, relieving themselves beside the dead. The weather brought additional torment. Winter cold gave way to spring rains that filled trenches with freezing water. Summer heat intensified the stench of death and brought swarms of flies. Soldiers suffered from exposure, trench foot, and disease alongside combat injuries. Water supplies were contaminated. Food came up irregularly and often spoiled. Medical evacuation was haphazard under constant bombardment. French soldiers described Verdun as l'enfer, hell itself. German soldiers used the same word, die Hölle. The fighting shifted to the west bank of the Meuse in March, as the Germans attempted to silence French artillery firing from positions on Le Mort-Homme, Dead Man's Hill, and Hill 304. These elevations provided crucial observation and artillery positions. The Germans launched repeated assaults, finally capturing both hills by late May after months of savage fighting. Tens of thousands died for these two relatively small features. The slopes became so saturated with corpses that they literally sank several feet from the accumulated dead. While the struggle raged on the heights, German attention returned to the east bank and the remaining French forts. Fort Vaux, smaller than Douaumont but still formidable, became the focus of German offensive efforts in May and June. Unlike Douaumont, Vaux was fully garrisoned when the Germans attacked. Major Sylvain Eugene Raynal commanded approximately 600 men inside the fort, which had been modernized with reinforced concrete, but had also been partially stripped of artillery before the battle. The German assault on Fort Vaux began with days of intensive bombardment. 8,000 shells per day pounded the fortifications starting in early March. The superstructure was torn apart, but the deep underground galleries and chambers remained intact. On June 1, German forces launched Operation May Cup, an all-out offensive along a narrow front targeting Fort Vaux and the remaining French defensive positions. By June 2, German assault troops reached the fort's exterior and began fighting their way inside. What followed was unprecedented in the war: sustained combat inside of fortifications, corridors, and chambers. The Battle of Fort Vaux became the first major engagement fought entirely inside a fort during World War I. German troops forced their way through shell-damaged entrances and into the maze of underground passages. The French garrison fell back to interior barricades, fighting from room to room, corridor to corridor. Hand grenades and rifle fire echoed through the confined spaces. The Germans employed flamethrowers, filling chambers with burning fuel and choking smoke. Gas attacks forced defenders deeper into the fort. Most critically, the fort's water supply failed. The garrison cistern had been damaged by bombardment, and water supplies were contaminated or exhausted. By June 4, conditions had become desperate. Major Raynal sent his last message via carrier pigeon, a bird named Valent. The message read, "We still hold, but we will suffer an attack by gas and very dangerous fumes. It is urgent that we withdraw. Do give us direct optical communication to Souville that does not answer my calls." This is my last pigeon. The pigeon succeeded in its mission despite being gassed during its flight and died after delivering the message. It would later become the only bird awarded France's Legion of Honor. By June 5, water supplies were exhausted. Men received a half pint of filthy water per day. Wounded soldiers suffered terribly from thirst. The garrison's situation was impossible. French relief attempts failed with heavy casualties. The Germans controlled the fort's exterior completely. On June 7, after 6 days and 5 nights of continuous fighting underground, with no water, dwindling ammunition, and no hope of relief, Major Raynal surrendered. The Germans recognized the extraordinary courage of Vaux's defenders. Crown Prince Wilhelm personally presented Major Raynal with a ceremonial sword in recognition of his garrison's heroic resistance. Raynal and his surviving men were treated with honor as prisoners and spent the remainder of the war in German captivity. The fall of Fort Vaux, coming so soon after Douaumont, brought the Germans to within 3 miles of Verdun itself and represented their high-water mark in the battle. Late June, the Germans launched what would be their final major offensive thrust toward Verdun. They employed a new weapon, phosgene gas shells, against Fort Souville and surrounding positions on June 23. This attack represented the most dangerous moment for the French defense. German troops reached to within 2.5 miles of Verdun's citadel. Fort Souville, the last major defensive position, came under intense assault. If Souville fell, Verdun itself would be indefensible. Yet here the German offensive finally exhausted itself. The salient was vulnerable to French artillery fire from three sides. German infantry, pushed forward relentlessly for months, had suffered enormous casualties and reached the limits of their endurance. Supply lines were overstretched. Most significantly, events elsewhere on the Western Front intervened to save Verdun. On July 1, 1916, the British and French launched their long-planned offensive on the Somme River, 100 miles north of Verdun. The opening day of the Somme became the bloodiest single day in British military history, with nearly 60,000 British casualties. Yet the massive offensive achieved its strategic purpose. It forced German high command to divert reserves away from Verdun. German offensive operations at Verdun ceased as units were pulled north to contain the Somme offensive. The pressure lifted from Verdun just as French defenses reached their breaking point. Throughout the summer, as the Somme raged, Verdun settled into positional warfare with local attacks and counterattacks, but no major offensive operations. The Germans retained the territorial gains they had made, including forts Douaumont and Vaux and the Western Bank Heights, but they no longer possessed the strength to push further. In May, Pétain had been promoted to command the Central Army Group, moving him away from direct command at Verdun. His replacement, General Robert Nivelle, proved more aggressive in temperament. Where Pétain had focused on methodical defense and limited counterattacks, Nivelle planned major offensive operations to recapture lost ground. Throughout summer and early autumn, Nivelle prepared a systematic counteroffensive, accumulating artillery ammunition, fresh divisions, and new tactical methods. On October 24, French forces launched a carefully prepared assault after days of intense artillery bombardment. Using new infiltration tactics, light machine guns, and mobile artillery. French troops advanced over 3 kilometers on the first day. Fort Douaumont, which had fallen so easily in February, was recaptured after fierce fighting. The Germans defended desperately, but their positions had become untenable. On November 2, French patrols entered Fort Vaux to find it abandoned. The Germans had evacuated during the night, unable to hold positions under renewed French pressure. Between December 15 and 18, French forces launched their final offensive of 1916 at Verdun. 4 French divisions assaulted German lines in a meticulously planned operation. By nightfall on December 15, they had retaken Poivre Hill. The advance continued, pushing German forces back almost to their starting positions of February 1916. The French captured and destroyed 115 guns and took 11,000 prisoners in just 4 days. On December 18, Hindenburg, who had replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the German General Staff in August, officially called off all German offensive operations at Verdun. The battle of attrition was over. Over 10 months, the Battle of Verdun consumed resources and lives on a scale almost incomprehensible. The two armies fired approximately 60 million artillery shells during the battle, creating a landscape so devastated that 9 villages were completely destroyed and never rebuilt. An area covering 65 square miles was declared a Zone Rouge, or Red Zone, where the concentration of unexploded ordnance, human remains, and chemical contamination made human habitation impossible. That designation remained in effect for decades. Casualty figures for Verdun have been debated by historians since the battle ended. In 2000, historians calculated total casualties of approximately 714,000 men, split almost evenly between the two armies. French casualties totaled 377,000, including approximately 162,000 killed or missing. German casualties reached 337,000, with approximately 143,000 killed or missing. An average of 70,000 men per month became casualties during the battle's 10-month duration. These numbers, as staggering as they are, fail to capture the true human cost. The wounded included men who would carry physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. Tens of thousands suffered from what was then called shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who experienced Verdun often could never adequately describe what they had endured to those who had not been there. The French called Verdun the mill or the mincing machine, terms that captured the industrial nature of the slaughter. The battle profoundly affected both nations. In France, Verdun became the supreme symbol of French determination and sacrifice in the Great War. The phrase "ils n'y passeront pas" entered the national mythology. The fact that 70 divisions of the French army had rotated through Verdun meant that the battle's trauma touched virtually every French family. Verdun came to represent not just a battle, but France's entire experience of the war, the ultimate test of national will that had been passed at terrible cost. For Germany, Verdun represented strategic failure. Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white had instead bled both armies white, with German losses approaching French losses despite the attackers' initial advantages. The battle consumed German strategic reserves without achieving a decisive result. The commitment to Verdun prevented German forces from dealing with the British offensive on the Somme effectively. Falkenhayn lost his position in August 1916, replaced by the duo of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, though his dismissal owed to multiple factors beyond Verdun alone. The battle demonstrated the bankruptcy of attrition as a strategic concept. Both sides possessed the industrial capacity and manpower reserves to sustain horrific casualties without breaking. The side that could better manage the psychological and physical strain would prevail, but victory in such circumstances became almost meaningless. The French held Verdun, but at what cost? The Germans inflicted massive casualties, but suffered nearly as badly themselves. The strategic situation on the Western Front remained essentially unchanged. Verdun also revealed serious flaws in military leadership on both sides. Falkenhayn's secretiveness about his true objectives created confusion that hampered German operations from the start. Crown Prince Wilhelm's desire to actually capture Verdun, rather than simply threaten it, led German forces into costly attacks that contradicted Falkenhayn's attrition concept. French complacency before the battle and Joffre's disarmament of Verdun's forts nearly led to disaster. Only Peytin's organizational skill and the extraordinary efforts of French soldiers prevented catastrophe. The battlefield itself became a vast cemetery and memorial. The Douaumont ossuary, completed in 1932, contains the remains of 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers gathered from the battlefield. The fortress and battlefield became sites of pilgrimage for veterans and families. French schoolchildren learned of Verdun as the defining moment of national unity and resistance. For decades after the battle, bomb disposal units continued removing unexploded ordnance from the area, a task that continues into the 21st century. The French Interior Ministry estimates that over 10 million shells remain in the soil around Verdun. The strategic lessons of Verdun influenced military thinking for decades. The battle demonstrated that modern firepower made breakthrough operations nearly impossible against prepared defenses. It showed that even massive artillery bombardments could not eliminate determined defenders in fortified positions. It proved that logistics and sustainment, as demonstrated by the Sacred Way, could be as important as tactical skill. It revealed that soldiers could endure almost unimaginable conditions if leadership and organization supported them adequately. Yet perhaps the most significant legacy of Verdun was its demonstration of industrialized warfare's true nature. This was combat shaped by artillery production, railway schedules, supply logistics, and industrial output as much as by soldiers' courage or commanders' skill. The battle became synonymous with futility, with sending men to die in a killing ground for objectives that often seemed meaningless. French soldier and writer Henry Barbas, who fought at Verdun, wrote that it represented humanity gone mad. The Battle of Verdun stands as one of the longest and most devastating battles in human history. For 10 months, two great nations fed the best of their youth into a landscape that killed methodically and without discrimination. They fought for symbolic positions, for national pride, for strategic concepts that proved bankrupt in practice. Both sides claimed victory, the French because they held Verdun, the Germans because they inflicted massive casualties. In truth, both lost. The real victor was the horror of industrial warfare itself. If you found this deep dive into one of World War I's most significant battles informative, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We explore military history's most consequential moments, bringing you thoroughly researched content that goes beyond the surface. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next historical journey. What other World War I battles would you like us to cover? Let us know in the comments below.